Something awful happened in Goodlettsville, Tennessee. A 12-year-old girl was found dead in her own home, and the whole town is in shock. After only a few hours away, her family returned to find their worst nightmare waiting for them.
Yhoana's murder was one of the more brutal cases that I've reviewed. It happened in a location that I think that most 12-year-olds would feel safe and secure, and that's in their home. When this child was found, she was found with a martial arts belt wrapped around her neck, not once, but twice. It was secured in the back with a double knot.
They found her in her room. Her neck was wrapped and choked, and she wasn't fully dressed. The sight was too much to bear. Nobody could believe this happened while they were out for such a short time. Before her death, the girl sent a message to her mother. It seemed normal at first, but once the police found out about it, it became the key to unlocking the truth.
Whoever did this took their time. When this child's earbuds were recovered, they were soaked in blood. These devices were in her ear, perhaps. As she is being checked out, she didn't see this guy coming.
The message was the missing link to the investigation. It gave the authorities a clue that they desperately needed to figure out who was responsible for this crime. Because of that one piece of evidence, police were able to identify who did it. This case shook everyone, especially because it happened in a place where she should have felt safe. It all starts in Goodlettsville, Tennessee, a small town with about 17,000 people living there. Goodlettsville is usually quiet, laid back, and just a simple place where people live their lives. But for one girl, this town didn't offer peace. Her name was Yhoana Arteaga. She was born in 2005 to Patricia Velasquez and Marlon Arteaga. But things didn't stay the same for long. When Yhoana was still little, Patricia and Marlon split up. Life changed after that. So after the split, Patricia took her 3 kids and moved them to a trailer park. That's where Yhoana grew up, along with her younger brother Oscar and her older sister Jocelyn, who was 2 years older. Their life wasn't perfect, but Patricia was always trying her best. Originally, she had been an architect in Mexico, but when she came to the United States and became a mother of 3, things shifted. Now, her life was all about her kids. She put everything she had into being the best mom she could be. Yhoana wasn't just any ordinary girl. She was a bit of a techie, totally into computers. On top of that, she loved karate. Her mom was super proud of her for that. And sadly, one of her karate belts was the one through which she was strangled and killed. It felt like, with the way Yhoana was going, she could have done anything in life. Patricia knew her daughter would be successful, but fate had other plans, and Yhoana never got the chance to get where her mom had hoped for. On that fateful day, August 10th, 2017, Yhoana stayed home alone. A little while earlier, she had injured herself skating, resulting in a fractured ankle. She was stuck on crutches and didn't feel like going out. That day, her mom and her siblings were headed out for a bit, but Yhoana didn't want to go with them. She was content to just hang out at home, take it easy, and watch a movie in her room. It seemed like a regular day, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the family left, something unimaginable was waiting to unfold. What should have been a quiet afternoon, resting and healing, was about to turn into something far darker. That evening, right around 6:45 p.m., something terrible happened. A 911 call came in, and it wasn't like any other call. You could hear the panic in the voices, but at that moment, Jocelyn, Yhoana's older sister, couldn't even think of their home address. It was like everything was frozen. Her mom, Patricia, couldn't even speak much, and the words she did get out were in Spanish. But even if you didn't understand the language, the message was clear. Someone had died, and the police needed to get there fast.
Listening to 911 tapes and, working with them in a number of homicide cases during my time as a prosecutor. The pain of a mother sounds the same in no matter what language you hear it. That there's just a certain tone, and once you hear it, it sits with you.
So after that, the officers rushed over. When they arrived at the house, they immediately knew why Patricia and Jocelyn were so frantic. The scene they walked into was heartbreaking. They found Yhoana tied up in her own bed, with her clothes not fully on. The scene made it clear that someone had just abused her sexually before murdering her. All of this occurred within a few hours while her family was away. What made the situation even more gut-wrenching was what the police found on Yhoana's body. They noticed something that felt so wrong. Yhoana had always been proud of her martial arts skills. She worked hard for her achievements in karate. But that very martial arts belt, the one that symbolized her success, was now being used in the worst way possible. It was wrapped around her neck twice and tied with a double knot. The belt that had once made her proud had become a tool for something horrifying. The pressure was so tight that blood vessels in her eyes and her face had burst. Whoever did this had taken their time. It wasn't something done quickly or in a rush. The investigators found her earbuds still in her ears. She might have been listening to something when the killer snuck up on her, never even realizing what was about to happen. It seemed like the attacker wanted to abuse her in some way, as her pants were pulled down. It was an attempt at something even more awful, but it looked like the person had changed their mind at the last second. Yhoana's death wasn't just brutal, it was a shock to the entire community. The sadness, the anger, it was overwhelming. Her family was completely shattering. So, after the initial investigation, the police did what they often do in cases like this. They started to go around the neighborhood, talking to people, asking questions, and trying to figure out if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. Yhoana was only 12 years old, too young to have any serious enemies or people who wanted to hurt her. She wasn't dating anyone, and nobody could think of a motive. So, the investigators focused on anyone nearby with a criminal past. And there it was, a neighbor just 2 doors down from Yhoana's house, named Roy Coons Jr. He had a criminal record from 30 years ago. The police knew they had to check him out. At first, though, the conversation with him didn't raise any alarms. They were going door to door, and when they spoke to Roy, he seemed like any other guy in the neighborhood. He didn't act strange or suspicious, but the detectives knew his history, and they couldn't just let him go without looking a little closer.
This is a man who has been arrested 102 times. And his first arrest started when he was 19 years old. In 1999, he was convicted of his 3rd DUI guilty. 2001, he was guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. 2006, he's guilty of 2 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. 2010, guilty of aggravated burglary.
Each time he got out, he violated parole over and over. His crimes kept getting worse. So, when Yhoana's murder happened, Roy's criminal record didn't exactly make him seem innocent.
I really don't know that much to put an idea on what happened or, what they had going on, or if you go into the house and she, surprised them. But even then, still, that wouldn't make no sense if you want to turn a burglary into a murder. I guess it's one of those things you just have to put yourself in that situation to find out.
So after that murder, the police kept a close eye on Roy. He lived just 2 doors down from Yhoana, and they wanted to make sure he wasn't involved. As the investigation continued, Roy acted strange. He was always hanging around outside, trying to figure out what was going on. You'd think a person in his situation would want to avoid the spotlight, but Roy seemed drawn to it. Every time officers came by, he was watching them, almost too interested in what they were doing. The weird part came when the police went back to his house for more questioning. Usually, people help out in a case like this, but Roy wasn't eager to talk. Was it because of his long history with the law, or was there something more? He got agitated every time they questioned him. One officer even noticed him peeking over toward Yhoana's house, which only made things more suspicious. After a few days of watching him, one female officer decided it was time to confront him again. She had been one of the first officers on the scene, and something about Roy just didn't sit right with her. When she approached him, Roy wasn't happy. He didn't want to talk.
Before long, they noticed that he was always peeking in the direction of Yhoana's place.
Anytime that you're on the scene of one of those crimes, and the police are there and the police are there for a long time, you're gonna have your looky-loos. You're gonna have your people that kind of stand around and watch. But there was something about Roy Coons that stood out to the female officer. She was the second officer that arrived on the scene, and she went, I feel like I need to go talk to him.
Even though it had been days since the murder, Roy acted like he didn't know much about what had happened just 2 doors away. Yet he was visibly frustrated about the police bothering him so much. The officers weren't backing down, though. They had a job to do, and Roy wasn't making it simple for them. His behavior raised red flags, and they started focusing on him more.
If you had a 12-year-old daughter that was killed, would you or would you not want us to do everything that we possibly can to find out what took place?
What happened down there? Her daughter got killed?
She's dead.
I know that, man.
Instead of being cooperative and clearing his name, Roy's attitude made the police even more suspicious. They asked him why he was so agitated. Was it because of the horror of what had happened in the neighborhood, or was there something else going on? The officers tried to explain that they just need to gather information and move on to the next person, but Roy wouldn't budge. His aggressive behavior only made the police dig deeper.
Are you agitated because of the horrors of what happened in your neighborhood? That's completely logical. But at the same token, you do have to recognize that law enforcement does need to do their job and do and conduct an investigation. Why can't you just provide the basic information needed so we can eliminate you as a suspect and move on to the next person?
Roy, back then 45 years old, lived with his parents. He didn't have a steady job and spent most of his time inside his house. The police were starting to get a clearer picture of who Roy really was, and it wasn't good. They decided it was time to get some evidence from him, so they picked up a cigarette butt he had tossed onto his front lawn. It might just be the clue they needed to determine if Roy had anything to do with the crime.
If you find something that has been discarded, there will be some element of you perhaps left behind. And what finer example of this than a cigarette butt? You're touching the exterior of the cigarette. But more importantly, you're essentially inoculating and introducing your saliva into the filter.
So, after Roy threw his cigarette butt onto his front lawn, the police didn't waste any time. They grabbed it, knowing that even something so small could hold big clues. You see, when you smoke, your saliva touches the filter, leaving behind DNA. It's gross, but for investigators, it's gold. They sent the cigarette to the lab, and soon enough, they were working on a DNA profile. The plan was to compare it to the DNA they'd already found at the crime scene.
Have you been inside since Patricia on it? Just the doorway. I'm here Monday. When I went down there and asked her about the lawnmower, she did the lawnmower. And then a couple times prior to that.
As the cops dug deeper into Roy's life, things started to get more complicated. They began questioning him more directly, trying to figure out if he knew anything about why someone would kill a little girl like Yhoana. When they asked him, Roy sounded unsure, almost like he was just guessing. He said something about how maybe it was a robbery gone wrong, like possibly someone broke in, not knowing Yhoana was home, and things spiraled from there. Was Roy just throwing random ideas at the detectives, or did he actually know more than he let on? So after that, the police pressed him for more details about his day when the murder happened. Roy claimed he only left his house to buy cigarettes and walk a friend's dog. He also admitted that sometimes he would mow Patricia's lawn. The investigators weren't convinced, though.
I can't get involved in that. I
got enough going on.
And the only reason we want to talk to you a little more because you were at home a little more than everybody else.
And like I said, I'm inside most of the time. I don't come out because I know how I am.
Right.
And I get riled up.
Just keep my number.
I got your number.
And it changes.
If I see anything or hear anything at all,
I'll call.
I will.
Then the lab results came back, and they hit the detectives with something shocking. The detectives found Roy's DNA in several unexpected places at the crime scene. They found his DNA on a windowsill at Yhoana's house, as well as on some of her clothing, a shirt and a sock. But the most alarming discovery was a YSTR match, which linked Roy's DNA to Yhoana's cheek, her arm, and her bottom. However, his DNA wasn't found on the martial arts belt used to strangle her, and none of the fingerprints discovered at the scene matched his. These mixed signals confused the investigators. Was Roy involved, or had he just been there before without anyone realizing? Even stranger, a day after Yhoana's death, a police officer spotted Roy walking down the street. He noticed something unusual: latex gloves sticking out of Roy's pocket.
Very difficult many times to find a latent print, or we don't have prints on the ends of our fingers. These are easily obliterated. You know, you got to keep in mind, and this is quite fascinating, the day after the homicide, Coons was actually walking down the road, and there was a police officer that was there. One of the things that the police officer noticed is that Coons had latex gloves hanging out of his pocket during that interaction.
The absence of fingerprints at the crime scene suggested that the gloves were not merely a coincidence. The DNA was there, but the prints were missing. It was a red flag that couldn't be ignored. Still, Roy wasn't done talking. When the police asked if he'd noticed anything strange around the neighborhood, he mentioned a truck. He rambled about seeing some odd vehicles and a fight involving one of them. He talked about a big custom truck that caught his attention in the days before Yhoana's murder. So after that, the officers couldn't just brush off Roy's strange behavior. His story about other people being involved seemed suspicious, but they had to consider every possibility. It wasn't just his DNA they found at the scene. There were traces of other men's DNA in the room and on Yhoana's body. This only complicated things further. The police had to figure out how Roy fit into the bigger picture and whether other people were involved.
Is there any reason that we could ever possibly find your DNA on her? I mean, I've shook her hand and stuff like that.
By this point, Roy Coons Jr. was the prime suspect. The police even told the media that they had DNA evidence linking him to the murder.
Scientific evidence analyzed by both the Metro Police Department and the TBI crime laboratories was crucial in this investigation.
As they gathered more information from Yhoana's family and neighbors, one thing became clear. Roy and Yhoana had never even met. He'd only been to the house a few times to cut the lawn and had briefly shaken hands with Patricia. So why was his DNA inside the house? You know how investigators sometimes let suspects keep talking to see if they slip up? That's exactly what happened here. Roy started filling in the silence, giving details about the crime that no one else could have known. The police had not disclosed any details about Yhoana's strangulation or the attempted sexual assault. Only her family and the detectives knew those details. So how did Roy know? He tried to say he'd heard it from someone outside, but the detectives weren't buying it.
First off, he was hanging around, and now he has intimate knowledge of a scene, something that no one else has had eyes on.
Even with all that, it still wasn't enough evidence to arrest Roy at that moment. As one retired detective, Melissa Pinkleton, said, people in close-knit communities like trailer parks sometimes overhear things, even if the police try to keep details quiet. Perhaps Roy had picked up bits of information through gossip, like a game of telephone, but the police weren't convinced that was all it was.
He knows that Yhoana has been strangled. That information was not public at the time the defendant knew it. 4:19 p.m. she identifies that the man who was knocking on the door of her trailer that day was the man who cuts the lawn. All the proof you've heard has shown that Roy Coons was the man who cut their lawn at that trailer.
Then, weeks after Yhoana's murder, the case took a turn. The police decided to look into her phone records. This is where Yhoana, in a way, helped solve her own case. The detectives found a chilling message she had sent to her mom at 4:15 p.m. on August 10th, the day of the murder. She wrote, "Mom, someone is knocking on the door." A few minutes later, at 4:19, Yhoana sent another message. "I think it's the man who cuts the yard." That man was Roy Coons Jr. This text was the one piece of evidence that tied him directly to the crime scene at the time of the murder. The message placed Roy at Yhoana's house, in contact with her just as everything was happening. It was the missing piece for the detectives to complete the puzzle. So, after all of this, the full, horrifying picture started to come together. Roy wasn't just a neighbor who cut the family's lawn. He had been lurking, watching, and waiting for the right moment. He knew their schedule and had likely been stalking them for a long time before making his move. Authorities arrested Roy Coons Jr. in September 2017 and charged him with Yhoana Arteaga's murder. Following Roy Coons Jr.'s arrest, the Tennessee police needed to reflect. Roy wasn't just any criminal. He had been arrested over 100 times. How was someone like that, with such a long list of parole violations, still walking around freely? It wasn't just a system failure. It was a failure that cost an innocent life. The police officers couldn't help but feel troubled by the fact that someone with Roy's record had been able to keep committing crimes.
For this police department that's not troubled by the fact that when we arrest people, that very, very often for violent crimes, that they have been arrested many times before and convicted, but are yet on the streets.
But now Roy was finally off the streets, locked up without bail. Everyone felt a bit of relief knowing he couldn't hurt anyone else. Well, everyone except for his family, who stood by him. Still, even with Roy in custody, the trial wasn't going to be easy. There were no witnesses who could confirm that Roy had been at Yhoana's home that day, and there wasn't much physical evidence aside from the DNA they found inside the house. The DNA, though, was enough to raise eyebrows. A YSTR profile, a type of DNA analysis, matched Roy's and was found on Yhoana's cheek and buttocks. But that alone wasn't enough for an effortless conviction.
I'm going to hear from a single eyewitness that Mr. Coons went in that mobile home on that day. You're not going to see any video footage from security cameras showing that he did that. You're not going to hear from any witnesses that he had any motive or had attempted to do anything to this family in the past.
In many murder cases, circumstantial evidence like this wouldn't be enough to send someone to prison. Roy's defense team knew this and fought back hard. They made sure to point out that there were no witnesses, no security camera footage, and no proof that Roy was motivated to harm Yhoana or her family. And then, of course, there were Yhoana's text messages to her mom. At 4:19 p.m., she identified Roy as the person knocking on the door, the man who cut their lawn.
"Mom, someone is knocking on the door." And then at 4:19, the victim wrote back to her mother, "I think it was the man who cuts the yard."
That message was one of the most damning pieces of evidence against him. It put him at the crime scene, right where the murder happened. When Yhoana spoke, the police didn't need a security camera or a witness.
Text message is a huge component. It puts him there. It puts him in contact with her right around the time that she was murdered.
But that wasn't all. After killing Yhoana, Roy had run off to a homeless shelter not too far from the trailer park. He thought he was safe, hiding from both the police and his community. But at the shelter, Roy started talking. He approached a man named Moses and asked a chilling question. "Have you ever killed somebody?" Moses didn't ask Roy for any details, but Roy went ahead and told him anyway. He admitted to the killing, though he didn't reveal who the victim was or how long ago it had happened.
He just asked me if I ever killed somebody. I didn't ask him if he ever did, but he told me he has. He didn't tell me who he was or how long it was, but he said he did. But this is his what that sticks with you. That's what he said. I was so freaked out. I never get scared.
Moses, who had no idea about the ongoing investigation, was so freaked out by the conversation that he eventually came forward as a witness. This confession was the final nail in Roy's coffin. Moses' testimony was all the jury needed to wrap up the case. On July 15, 2019, the jury reached a verdict. The jury found Roy Coons Jr. guilty on 2 counts: second-degree murder and felony murder.
We, the jury, find the defendant Ronald Donald Coons Jr. in count 1 guilty of second-degree murder. Count 2, felony murder, guilty.
I walked over and I put a candle in his hand, and all he did was drop his head and walked away. My gut feeling was, he's got a guilty conscience.
He was sentenced to life in prison plus an additional 25 years. The case had finally come to an end, and justice for Yhoana had been served.
I can't apologize for a crime I didn't commit, but I will say I'm sorry for your loss.